All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really intense, fast-moving military escalation that went down between the U.S. and Iran on July 28, 2026. If you follow Middle East geopolitics, you already know things can flip in a heartbeat. But the events of this single day, they represent a massive, massive spike in regional tensions. We're going to stick strictly to the facts and the statements as they unfolded on the ground, so we can figure out exactly how a fragile diplomatic pause suddenly exploded into a multi-front exchange of fire.
To really grasp the stakes of this crisis, we have to start with a deeply alarming statement from U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM. They announced that, and I quote, all Iranian missiles were successfully intercepted in an attempted surprise attack. I mean, think about the gravity of that for a second. We're not talking about a minor border skirmish here. This was a direct launch of ballistic missiles. It's exactly the kind of flashpoint that instantly spooks global markets and makes you wonder, just how close are we to a larger, completely uncontrollable conflict?
Section 1. The Surprise Missile Attack. According to CENTCOM, the exact moment things went kinetic was at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time. That's when forces from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, launched multiple ballistic missiles from inside Iran. Their target? U.S. forces based over in Jordan. Now, what's really fascinating here is the deliberate ambiguity from the military early on. CENTCOM confirmed the time and the weapons, sure, but in those first few hours, they explicitly held back on identifying the exact location of the targeted U.S. troops. They did, however, confirm that all missiles were intercepted and that forces were on high alert.
Just mapping out the timeline for July 28th shows you how insanely fast this escalated. In the morning, you've got these tense meetings happening in Washington, D.C., with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu presenting new intelligence on Iran's military capabilities right at the White House. Just a few hours later, at 5:45 p.m., boom, the intercepted missile attack happens. And then, less than 3 hours after that, at 8:42 p.m., CENTCOM announces the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are launching counterstrikes. It is a textbook example of how fast we can go from an intelligence briefing to the battlefield.
Moving on to Section 2, Retaliation in Iraq.
So the U.S. and its allies, they didn't exactly sit on their hands. They pivoted the conflict right into neighboring territory. To understand this retaliation, we have to look at the chain of causality here. Step 1 wasn't actually just the ballistic missiles. It was part of a broader, sustained campaign. Over the previous 72 hours, there had been over 30 aerial drone attacks, directed by the IRGC, targeting Saudi energy sites from inside Iraq. And that relentless pressure? It leads us directly to Step 2. The U.S. and Saudi fighter aircraft launched a unified response, conducting precision strikes across eastern Iraq to hit the Iran-aligned proxy groups that were launching those drones.
Let's pause on that number for a second. 30. 30 separate drone attacks aimed at vital Saudi energy infrastructure in just 3 days. That is a massive, relentless volume of aerial assaults. And it really highlights exactly why the U.S. and Saudi Arabia felt they absolutely had to execute those precision strikes in eastern Iraq. They needed to degrade that operational capability, and fast.
Which brings us to Section 3, Competing Claims and Casualties.
Now, as with literally any military action, the story you hear depends entirely on who's telling it. And the contrasting narratives here are just stark. On one side, the official U.S. position from CENTCOM clearly states their fighter jets targeted multiple terrorist logistics and weapons sites, framing the whole thing strictly as a precision military operation. On the flip side, Iranian government spokesperson Fatima Mahajirani held a press briefing claiming those U.S. attacks caused, and I quote, severe damage to civilian infrastructure. We're looking at two totally different realities for the exact same event. As always, our job is to neutrally analyze both.
So what exactly is Iran claiming got hit? According to their government spokesperson, the damage was absolutely crippling to the civilian sector. They're stating the Bushehr Meteorological Center was almost completely leveled, that the Bushehr airport is now totally inoperable, and that the maritime control tower at Chabahar was destroyed. On top of that, they're claiming 12 bridges and 2 tunnels were wiped out. Now keep in mind these are statements coming straight from Tehran, but they paint a very deliberate picture of widespread economic and civilian devastation.
And then there's the human toll they're reporting, which is just staggering. Mohajirani claimed that more than 350 Iranian government employees were killed in these strikes. Now, we absolutely must note that this is an unverified assertion. But, verified or not, we have to highlight this number to understand the sheer severity of the claims Tehran is projecting onto the global stage. It sets a deeply, deeply antagonistic tone for whatever happens next.
All right, Section 4, the wider regional crisis.
Because look, this whole situation isn't just about evening ballistic missiles and late-night fighter jet strikes. All of this violence is tied to a much larger, incredibly complex regional flashpoint. It really comes down to geography. Despite all the explosions in Iraq and the skies over Jordan, the strategic Strait of Hormuz remains the absolute center of gravity for this entire US-Iran confrontation. This narrow strip of water is one of the most vital maritime choke points on Earth. Whoever squeezes the Strait of Hormuz essentially squeezes the entire global economy.
When you actually start connecting the geographic dots, you see how sprawling this proxy war really is. It's like a giant puzzle of interconnected flashpoints. You've got the naval blockade operations happening near the Strait of Hormuz. You've got commercial shipping lanes in the Red Sea under constant threat. You have critical Saudi energy sites absorbing waves of drone strikes. And you've got these proxy bases over in eastern Iraq acting as launch pads. Every single time a match is struck in one of these zones, the ripple effects slam right into global energy markets and international shipping.
In fact, right in the middle of all this chaos, on the exact same day, July 28th, there was a parallel escalation. The Houthis took to social media to announce they had fired multiple ballistic missiles at a Saudi oil tanker, the NCC Ghazal, right out in the Red Sea. Their justification? They claimed the ship was violating a maritime blockade. It just goes to show you how synchronized and multi-layered the threats to these global energy corridors actually are.
Finally, Section 5. Diplomacy on the brink.
With all this kinetic action popping off everywhere, we really have to look at the political backdrop here. To truly grasp why this particular missile attack is so significant, let's rewind the timeline a bit. Earlier in the year, around February 28th, President Trump announced major joint U.S.-Israeli combat operations against Iran. Fast forward to June, and things had actually cooled down. Delegations from the U.S. and Iran had started negotiations based on a signed memorandum of understanding. They were literally trying to hammer out a war-ending deal. And just one day before the missile attacks, on July 27th, the geopolitical compass was actually pointing toward peace. And here is the absolute kicker, the context you absolutely need to take away from this explainer. Reports were indicating that President Trump had specifically held off on issuing his latest escalation threat against Iran. The whole idea was to pause the military posturing and give that fragile June diplomacy a real chance to work. The U.S. administration was actively trying to keep a lid on the powder keg, literally just hours before the IRGC launched their surprise missile attack.
This push to maintain a diplomatic pause was so intense, it was even causing friction with close allies. Remember those morning White House meetings on July 28th? Well, President Trump reportedly criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu over that new Israeli intelligence, the stuff they called the Pickaxe Mountain Intel, regarding Iran's military capabilities. It shows you an administration agonizing over how to balance really alarming intelligence from a key ally against this desperate hope to keep a diplomatic window open. But, as we know, after 5:45 p.m. on July 28th, everything changed. Which leaves us with this massive overarching question to ponder. If the U.S. intentionally hit pause on escalation to give those June negotiations a fighting chance, can that diplomacy possibly survive a surprise ballistic missile attack and a raging multi-front proxy war? With global energy supplies and the stability of the Strait of Hormuz hanging by a thread, this single day has forced the entire world to hold its breath and wait to see what happens next. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and stay curious.